morning and welcome to the fourth and final event in our Flood and Coast Digital Series 2020. My name is Terry Fuller and I'm the Chief Executive of FCERM. Now, before we start this morning's event, I'd like to mention some changes to the programme resulting from the passing of His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and also to take a moment to pay our respect. We at FCERM received the news of the passing of His Royal Highness the Prince Philip with great sadness. His Royal Highness became an honorary fellow of FCERM in 1966, which is yet another example of the length of service he gave to the organisations and causes that he cared about. His Royal Highness very generously gave his time to us in direct support of our activities, and we're gathering the recollections of our members at the moment to gain a full appreciation of just how much he did. Recollections so far include His Royal Highness joining a FCERM dinner in the 1990s. And on that occasion, he helped to ensure the atmosphere was informal, and he spoke with knowledge, enthusiasm, and insight about water and the environment, and an interest in our work. I myself was privileged to meet His Royal Highness at Buckingham Palace in 2013 for our inaugural David Bellamy lecture, and experienced firsthand his knowledge of our institution and the depth of knowledge that can only come from many years spent encouraging responsible stewardship of our natural world. To take the stance that he did, when he did, was remarkable. All UK government departments are now in a period of mourning until one day after the Duke's funeral. And therefore this has impacted the speaker lineup, with the Environment Agency no longer taking part. Material around the Thames scheme, which was to be presented, will be developed and shared with all delegates in due course. Now, as a mark of respect, I invite you all to join us now in observing a 1-minute silence to remember Prince Philip. Thank you very much. So today's event is the fourth and final event of our 2020 digital series. Our previous events have been hugely successful as measured by your feedback, and we owe thanks to all of our past speakers. Throughout those events, one topic featured highest in all of our questions and answer sessions: funding. And this morning, we dedicate our entire event to discovering innovative investment in flood and coastal risk management. We're very grateful to our headline sponsor, Federated Hermes International, for their support at this event, and to our speakers and supporters, including our advisory group, and of course, our wonderful production team at FCERM and the Environment Agency. We'll be using Slido in the session to capture questions during our 2 live question and answer sessions, and slightly expanded sessions as well, which I hope you'll appreciate. Now, you can access Slido in 2 ways, through the main device that you're viewing this event on now. But just bear in mind, if you maximize the viewing window, Slido could get lost behind it, so you'll just need to minimize and search for that. The alternative way is if you have a spare device like a mobile phone, then you can access Slido through the app, and you use the code FC4 to access that. Now, please do post questions on Slido. We want some lively debate, and to ensure that please ensure you direct them specifically to speakers wherever possible. Also use the voting buttons. If you like a question and you really want that to be asked, promote it up to the top and we will do our best to get to it. So please do get questioning and voting. Okay. It gives me great pleasure now to hand over the chair of this event to Emma Harvey. Now, Emma joined the Green Finance Institute in 2019 and leads a portfolio of coalitions and projects, including the Coalition for Energy Efficiency in Buildings. Emma has previously worked across several areas within Barclays Bank. And throughout this period, she championed the Green Finance agenda, supporting the bank's first green bond issuance and pioneering the Barclays Green Home Mortgage. Emma, it's a real delight to have you join us this morning, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry, and welcome everybody. We are really delighted that you're able to join the innovative investment session of the FCERM. Over the next 2 hours, we are going to be exploring a number of real-world case studies of financial innovation in this sector. Our first speakers are going to set out the strategic scene and the international scene for innovation in this sector. And following their talks, you're going to have an opportunity for question and answers. So please do start putting your questions into the Slido. After that, our second set of speakers will introduce a number of exciting on-the-ground case studies that are happening here in the UK, demonstrating the opportunity for innovation at home. But before we move on to our speakers, it's worthwhile spending a little bit of time setting the scene on where green finance is, both in the UK and internationally. Now, green finance is typically viewed in two lenses. There is greening finance and financing green, which sounds like semantics, but is very important. Greening finance is all around financial institutions appropriately managing the risks related to climate change and the transition to a net zero economy. It focuses on reporting, disclosure, targets, taxonomies, and definitions. The greening finance agenda was kickstarted by the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, which are going to become mandatory in the UK and a number of different countries over the coming years. And so greening finance, managing risks. Financing green is all around deploying capital towards environmentally positive activities and real economy outcomes. There are three core tenets underlying the financing of green. The first is collaboration. We need collaboration across sectors that have previously been unrelated in order to tackle the incredibly complex challenge of climate change. We need innovation, new products, services and mechanisms that can help move investment towards those positive environmental activities. And third is education, not just education of consumers or users of finance, but also education of financial institutions themselves, so they are fully informed to make decisions on appropriate environmentally positive investments. Now, we've seen the green finance sector grow rapidly over the past decade, growing from just a few small niche funds, often focused on renewable energy, to a sector that covers all asset classes and all types of finance, from retail finance to investment banking, from asset finance and asset management to insurance. And a high point of 2020 was the record-breaking issuance of $269.5 billion of green bonds, a market that has grown rapidly in recent years. Now, as we enter the decade of transition, the 2020s, there is a real need for rapid action, impactful action, and practical action. And finance acts as a critical enabler for achieving this outcome. And this is where the Green Finance Institute can play a role. We were set up in the summer of 2019 by the UK government and the City of London Corporation, with the aim of mainstreaming green finance, both in the UK and internationally. The Institute convenes cross-sectoral collaborations and coalitions that aim to identify the barriers to investment into decarbonising particular end sectors of the economy, and then works collaboratively with industry to bring these solutions to market, to test them, to demonstrate them, and to scale them, catalyse them further action across the industry. Our flagship coalition, the Coalition for the Energy Efficiency of Buildings, has been running for about 18 months now and has focused on how finance can support the retrofitting of buildings and homes in the UK. But we're very excited to say that in the coming months and years, we're going to be exploring how our rigorous practical methodology, which has brought together over 300 individuals, all working towards launching new financial solutions, how that methodology can support innovation in other countries, initially looking at Europe, but of relevance to today, next year we're hoping to also start looking at resiliency of buildings and how resiliency finance can be expanded from there. So all this demonstrates is that we do need practical action and we need people to pick up the mantle and drive the innovation forward. And so I think this is a perfect opportunity to introduce our first speaker, James Vicaro, a special advisor to Triodos Bank. James is a strategist and systems thinker with a background in sustainable finance. He runs the strategy consultancy Repattern, part of Now Partners. He is a special advisor to Triodos Bank and previously Director of Strategy and MD of the UK Investments Business and Interim Director of the Climate Safe Lending Network. James has served as a member of several advisory groups on the sustainable finance in the UK, European and international levels, including the Global Steering Committee for the UNEP Finance Initiative, where he was one of the founding members of the UN Principles for Responsible Banking. James is also a Senior Associate of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, Senior Fellow and previous Chair of the Finance Innovation Lab and Director of Regen and Advisor for a small number of NGOs in Europe. James is going to talk to us today about sustainable innovative finance from an international perspective and the work that Triodos have been undertaking from climate resiliency perspective. Over to you, James.
Thanks, Emma, and a real pleasure to be here. So in terms of my talk and my background, and thank you for the very comprehensive introduction, to say a little bit about the challenge of finance practically in some of these situations. At Triodos Bank, where I was for more than 20 years, I was involved in helping companies find and raise capital, in particular in the environmental and social sectors. Our team, the corporate finance team, who's still going, are one of the leaders in social impact bond market and social ventures. And I've had little bits of experience, although this is a new community for me in terms of flood and coast, but on the coastline, I was a director of Marine Current Turbines, an innovative tidal company who had the demonstration project at Strangford Lough, and was director of Walney Offshore Wind, which was the largest offshore wind farm. What I did when leaving Triodos as a full-time director was set up Repattern, because although a lot of the technologies like wind energy back when I started 20 years ago were very fragmented, it was actually something which became more standardized, to the extent that when I was starting wind energy finance in 1998, 99, there was almost nowhere else that you could go for this finance. And now it's really quite standard practice. The different players are all connected to one another. They know how things work. The contracts are standardized, and it's just funding another project. What I was interested in, though, is in the social sector and in natural capital models. There were so many different stakeholders where the value and the contributions needed to be made that were all differentiated, that we needed some intervention to repattern the connections, the relationships, the contracts, and ultimately the flows of finance in order to get new sustainability business models. So if you move to the next slide, Where I now live, having come back from the Triodos headquarters in the Netherlands, this is a picture of Haysborough. So apart from financing Ness Point, which is the easterlymost point in the UK's wind turbine, this is just up the coast for me in Norfolk, where I now live. And this is one of the houses which is, as you can see, falling into the coast. There was a mortgage on this property, which was previously valued at over £250,000. And the homeowners are getting letters to say, you're actually now worth £1. It's worth noting that 70,000 properties have probably been built in floodplains over the last decade. So that's probably around 20 billion of capital, which is quite literally going down the drain. Let's just compare that for a moment as a sort of sobering introduction with the 12 billion underpinning the 10-point plan. Right, next slide, please, to try and get some more positivity. So one of the things that Triodos Bank does a lot of is organic and regenerative agriculture. Firstly, to just understand where some of the benefits in nature-based solutions come. Well, this is what happens when you have conventional agriculture and you compare it to nature, and this is the most visual demonstration of what's going on beneath the surface. So when people make a big hoo-ha about nature-based solutions, well, it's quite hard to visualize. This is a good visual in terms of look at the root system on the right between what happens in conventional agriculture, and look at the root system on the left in terms of nature and grasslands, which are kind of managed to be able to not just sequester carbon, but to build in nutrients, to have the resilience for land, which has got huge value. Although at the moment, the markets for, well, how do you actually represent that value, trade that value, have contracts which can reflect the value that it has to be able to unlock investments. This is a thing which is in development right now. Next slide. This is, you won't see the detail of this, just look at the concentrate on the pie chart on the bottom. This is one of Triodos Bank's farming clients who we sort of been trying to track the carbon impact of a farm. And the little brown slice that you see there was the estimated emissions, given that there was livestock on the farm and the amount of land, and you look it up. When the actual farm, which is a regenerative biodynamic farm, farming over 1,000 acres, did a full carbon balance assessment, it found that generating the layers of soil and health was actually sequestering 10 times more than it was emitting. There's not yet the full kind of possibility to kind of turn that into markets, but this is the kind of cutting edge. And as we see developments from various people putting in place the new systems for valuing this benefit, this will create new markets and new opportunities to invest. Next slide, please. In terms of, well, what is it that you do to actually practically go about creating these new business models? Because it can sound quite theoretical to say, well, we just need to look at all these different benefits and all these different stakeholders. How do you start to break it down? This comes from a model from a friend of mine, Helen Topsipeus, leading a project called Nativation in the EU, which was mostly around urban natural capital. I think it's entirely can be entirely repurposed, and with a little bit of modification could be entirely relevant for many other business models. Firstly, being able to break down where are the benefits, the economic benefits, the biophysical benefits, the social benefits, and cultural benefits. This isn't exhaustive, but you can see there's many different subcategories where you can then start to kind of break down, well, for each of those, what is it that a business model, your potential project perhaps, is generating? It's unlikely that there's nil impacts on every single one of these. So in terms of those impacts, then you need to ask the question, well, who's getting the benefits? Who are the stakeholders who are beneficiaries? who's providing those benefits, who's doing the work, and who's potentially paying those benefits. And this can enable the construction of the business model. So firstly, it starts with a conversation, and in a way, my practice now, repattern, is all about how do you bring people into the room in the first place? That can often require overcoming a skepticism threshold. Investors might say, well, I'm not sure I've ever seen a deal like that before, so why should I get in the room? Other stakeholders might say, oh, doesn't that come from this foundation? Well, they've got no money, so how are they going to do anything? Or, well, this local authority, I mean, surely that will just be full of bureaucracy. So actually, being able to get the suspension of disbelief that it is possible to have that kind of alignment, which could lead to the contracting, is potentially the most difficult stage. When you get them in, then there's the process of being able to parse out where are the benefits going to come from, who's going to receive the benefits, who's potentially going to pay for those benefits. And what often is the case is that there's far more benefits in the room than anyone could imagine kind of getting for themselves, but it only appears if everybody contributes and builds a project. And I'll give a couple of examples of that right now. Next slide. I just wanted to mention a historical reference. I was just discussing before with a colleague who's from the Netherlands. I've just come back from the Netherlands. The Polder Model is one of the most famous kind of innovations in terms of the reclamation of land in the Netherlands. And I've been up to the polders several times. And there's an awful lot of incredible engineering and technology innovation, which happened quite some time ago, and the Dutch are very famous for it. I, however, would argue that the most important feature of it is the social innovation, because underneath the polders model is a system of relationships and contracts between individual farmers who recognize that their collective resilience is all dependent on everybody locking in and being part of one set of agreements. In fact, certain farmers have got agreements to say that, well, their land would be flooded first in compensation for a certain payment in order to protect other landowners. It's an incredibly intricate and well woven into what I experienced into a lot of Dutch culture, and has been expressed as now the sort of the mechanism for underpinning a lot of political decision making. It's not done overnight, but what happens is that once it's in place, it's actually reinforced. Nobody is going to, in a prisoner's dilemma set, defect from this, because they know that the collective collective safety of everybody is dependent upon everyone being within the system. Next slide fast forwards it to today, and this is a Triodos case study. So Triodos Bank, the corporate finance team that I helped set up, and is now staffed with people who are far more talented in corporate finance than me, have been pioneers in being able to take what has been some of this kind of innovation within the sector, and being able to get it to become investment ready. So this is the Wirra catchment, working with the Rivers Trust, and there's other projects in Devon with Wetland Restoration and Pennines in peatland restoration. This was a pilot project between Esme Fairbairn Foundation, DEFRA, and the Environment Agency, but it's now being rolled into something which the Triodos team has played quite a role in helping to shape, which is the Investment Readiness Fund, which is providing grants to project developers to be able to get that investment readiness, to pull together what might be a concept in real contracts. What that means is, well, if there are benefits to, for example, flood reinsurance, or the landowner, in terms of biodiversity benefits and carbon benefits, it can be pulled together in such a way that those parties contract on a payment for benefits. So as long as certain criteria are being met, then there will be payments to underpin what would then be the investment from third-party investors. And this model has been used in environmental impact bonds, which were modelled upon social impact bonds, around over a decade ago now. And so these projects are coming out, certainly signpost anyone to the Investment Readiness Fund. And I think that some of the early projects from these pilots from Triodos Bank will be coming out imminently. Final slide, please. In terms of partnerships and models of the future, this is the Leven Partnership, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, who, despite being Environmental Protection Agency and a regulator, have been incredibly innovative and catalyzing in bringing together a partnership across all different parties, local authorities, business, charitable organizations, nature organizations, in a regeneration model for an entire sub-region. So in co-creating a master plan with specific concrete projects. There was an old railway line which is being restored, thinking about, well, what are the co-benefits? If we're going to restore the railway line and connect up communities, how do we build in nature to that? How do we create destinations along the way? Building the design optimization of projects, because one project is not just doing resilience. It is probably having carbon benefits, biodiversity benefits, benefits to householders in the region. But with the right contractual framework to bring this together and the right investment readiness advice, this could lead to new investment, which once it's actually come together and the money has started to flow, those stakeholders recognize that there's no way that they could get that amount of value out of a project for the contribution they've done were it not for others coming together. Going back to them the second time, therefore, is a much easier ask than the first time. So my hope and actual fairly high degree of confidence is that as these markets build, there's a virtuous circle which makes them easier to do in the future. And certainly I'm on the lookout for the inspiring and innovative projects to be able to kind of get the ball rolling in this particular sector. Very much look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, James. Fantastic speech there. And very interesting, the point you raise around the complex interaction between benefits and investments and how there needs to be the suspension of disbelief to actually allow projects to become investable. And interesting parallels drawn as well between nature-based solutions being at an early stage in their evolution and drawing parallels to how the offshore wind sector was established and in the space of just a decade is now one of the absolute pinnacles of the UK's leadership in green finance. So thank you, James. We're now going to hear from Charlotte Splytoff from Queensland Reconstruction Authority. As manager of flood risk projects at the Queensland Reconstruction Authority, or the QRA in Australia, Charlotte works collaboratively with a range of stakeholders on policies and projects related to flood risk management. QRA manages and coordinates the Queensland Government's programme of recovery and reconstruction works within disaster-affected communities. Charlotte has 12 years' experience in a variety of roles and started her career in the Netherlands, designing levies. This role included leading a chapter of the International Levy Handbook, for which she received the European Young Professional Award, awarded by the European Federation of Engineering Consultancy Associations. Charlotte is an active member of Floodplain Management Australia and Queensland's Flood Community of Practice. The latter she helped to establish in 2014. Charlotte will now explore the investment practices from an international and Australian perspective. Thanks, Charlotte. Over to you.
I don't think I'm on the screen yet, but you may hear me already. Is it correct? Very good. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Emma, for your very kind introduction. Let me first start with a bit of a scene setting. So Queensland spans a vast and diverse landscape with a size 7 times that of Great Britain. We have about 5.2 million people living in Queensland, and our state has 77 local government areas consisting of rural, remote, indigenous, coastal, and urban communities. 75% of our population lives in coastal areas or on a floodplain, and flooding causes more damage in Queensland than any other natural hazard. Queensland is also the most disaster-affected state in Australia. Over the last decade, we have seen over 80 significant natural hazard events, with over $16.4 billion in reconstruction works, mostly on roads, bridges, and floodplains. That's Australian dollars. But there have been far greater human, social, and environmental and economic costs. The costs from disasters in Queensland are forecast to exceed $18.3 billion per year by 2050, and this does not include the effects of climate change. Next slide, please. We have reached a tipping point. Queensland finds itself in an area of repeat and overlapping severe weather events. Many of our communities are in a permanent state of recovery. From our 77 councils, 75 councils have been impacted by a disaster event in the last 3 years, and some of them more than once. The summer of 2018-19 was the first where we experienced 12 natural disaster events in 1 year, and this included catastrophic bushfire events, 3 cyclones and severe storms, multiple flooding events, including the 2019 monsoon trough event. And that event saw a loss of 500,000 heads of cattle, 8,000 properties flooded, and a modeled cost in the order of $5.6 billion. As natural disasters worsening, we have to keep asking ourselves, how do we adapt to be better prepared? Historically, investment in disaster management in Australia has been focused on recovery and the reconstruction of infrastructure, with approximately 97% of all disaster funding in Australia is being spent after a disaster, and only 3% is spent on mitigation and resilience activities. The prime vehicle for recovery funding is the Australian Disaster Recovery Funding Arrangement, the DRFA, through which joint Commonwealth and state funding is provided for financial assistance to help communities recover from eligible disasters. The QRA, the Queensland Reconstruction Authority, administers the DRFA on behalf of the Queensland Government. Over the last 10 years, we've seen a changing balance in recovery and resilience funding. We have recognized that recovery provides an opportunity to incorporate resilience, and in Queensland, we have a lot of experience in this space. The DRFA has several mechanisms for investing in resilient infrastructure. Firstly, the effective use of complementary funding from other resources. And through the reform of the DRFA, a new mechanism has been established that provides for the ability to use efficiencies or savings from our reconstruction program to be reallocated to mitigation and resilience activities. Now, the distribution of these savings is not immediate, but it will provide for a pipeline of investment in resilience in the coming years. And then there's our Betterment Funding under the DRFA, which allows for damaged essential public assets to be replaced or repaired to a more disaster resilient state following a disaster. Queensland is the only state in Australia that has administered betterment funds. Due to the strong demand of Queensland communities, we have had 4 betterment funds since 2013, exceeding $214 million. Of the 370 betterment projects completed in that time, over 2/3 of them have been impacted at least once by a subsequent event. 96% of these projects were not damaged, meaning that the avoided reconstruction costs now exceed the betterment investment for those assets. But more importantly, those assets continue to provide services to the communities during a disaster event. Next slide, please. At a global level, and particularly since the adoption of the Sendai framework in 2015, there has been a shift in the concept of disaster resilience to be more inclusive of the broader sustainable development goals. Please. Not sure if you can. I may have dropped out for a second. I had to re-sign. Oh, good, great. I had to re-log into my computer. So since the Sendai framework, there's been a shift in the concept of disaster resilience to be more inclusive of the broader sustainable development goals. And the Australian government is also driving a renewed focus on disaster risk reduction and resilience. It set up the National Resilience Task Force in 2018 to lead nationwide reforms to reduce the impact and financial burden of disasters on communities and the economy. In order to achieve these global and national goals, a disaster resilience line of sight means a true alignment of strategy and action from the local level to the global level. And this will ultimately ensure a well-aligned and risk-appropriate funding and decision-making across government and the private sector. The National Resilience Task Force developed the National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework in 2018, which sets the national policy agenda for coordinated action. Now, one of the 4 priorities under this framework is enhanced investment. And one of the strategies for action under this priority is to develop disaster risk reduction investment tools and to provide practical guidance on investment mechanisms. One of the pilot projects to achieve this is the Resilience Investment Vehicle pilot project, which seeks to fund a range of infrastructure that builds community resilience to natural hazards. It recognizes that private investment can be mobilized to fund disaster risk mitigation, and it aims to direct public and private capital to finance new and/or adapt existing infrastructure that reduces disaster risks, builds resilience, and derives a financial return for investors. The working group for this pilot consists of the Insurance Australia Group, the National Australia Bank, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, QRA, and our equivalent in New South Wales, Resilient New South Wales. The working group is considering the Queensland Government's Household Resilience Programme as a potential pilot. This program provides funding to eligible homeowners in the coastal areas in northern Queensland to improve the resilience of their homes against cyclones. This program is recognized by insurers to improve insurance affordability. Overall, the retrofitted homes were 63% less likely to suffer total loss, and insurers decreased premiums for those homes by an average of 8.5%. The working group is examining the possibility of employing commercial finance to fund cyclone mitigation works via a top-up mortgage product for the property owner to undertake a specific set of activities. A return on investment is secured in 3 ways. The private debt is bundled up by a bank into a resilient bond that is offered up to the investor market at an agreed rate of return, a bit like green bonds work. It will create incentives for customers through the potential for a deduction on the mortgage rate for a retrofitting component. And lastly, for the banking and the insurance perspective, benefits include a reduced risk for the asset, the home, which should lead to a reduced frequency and the size of claims, and a greater security of the asset for mortgage repayments. Next slide, please. In 2017, QRA updated the Queensland Strategy for Disaster Resilience to incorporate climate change risk and to deliver a comprehensive all-hazard approach to building disaster resilience throughout Queensland. Resilient Queensland, the implementation plan of this strategy, the key outcome of that is the development of regional resilient strategies, when the ultimate outcome is that by 2022, every region in Queensland is part of a blueprint that strengthens resilience. And these strategies clearly identified the risks of those regions and the communities, sets out strategies to improve the local resilience capability and capacity, and prioritizes resilient action that can be linked to funding opportunities. The locally led, regionally coordinated and state-facilitated approach to developing these regional resilience strategies was tested during the engagement phase of Resilient Queensland and delivered 4 pilot resilience strategies for the Mary, Fitzroy, Burnett and Central West regions of Queensland. Next slide, please. That is the closing slide. We do recognize that the enormous catalyst effect that large-scale events have had on our thinking, our approach, and our ability to innovate. Given the diversity of our landscape and of our communities, our strategies to drive disaster resilience must recognize local needs to ensure we have fit-for-purpose, locally driven solutions. Through our journey over the last 10 years, we have found that local communities are best placed to know their risks, their opportunities, and their needs. They are also best placed to develop and implement local plans supported by the states and Commonwealth governments. Communities that are well prepared and supported before a disaster occurs are more resilient and able to recover faster. We must continue our shift in thinking from reconstruction and recovery to preparedness and mitigation, and ultimately transform to a resilience mindset across all sectors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlotte. Again, another fantastic insight into the innovative opportunities happening around the world. Now, 3 points really stuck out from your talk there. One was around tapping into local communities and ensuring that you really draw on local expertise and knowledge. The second was actually on aligning a collaboration between the finance sector, science and policymakers. And the third was around the need for a systems approach, looking at where cash flows from energy efficiency measures can then be redeployed to resiliency measures. So really fascinating. Thank you, Charlotte. And thank you very much to both of our first speakers. We will now be moving straight into a Q&A session, and we're going to open up the conversation to the virtual floor and take questions from the audience. I hope that you have been engaging energetically with Slido, and Terry is going to relay some of the top questions for us to consider and discuss. So Terry, do we have some good questions?
Thanks very much, Emma. Yes, we do, is the answer to that. We have plenty of great questions, and I can see that our speakers have been very diligently replying to some of those, which is great. But I'd still like to open them up to discussion and to the floor, actually. So we'll go straight to the most popular question, and it's no surprise to me actually that it is a popular question. So it's to you, James. Does the finance that you're talking about cover both initial capital but also revenue spend for things like maintenance of nature-based solutions?
Yeah, and I've been overwhelmed by the whole range of questions. It's great that it's there. I'd say that in any financial model, you have to integrate the initial capital and the maintenance. So the sort of the glib answer is yes, if you're going to be able to get it funded. That can be more challenging if you've got infrastructure which requires maintenance, which kind of maybe escalates as it gets older. A lot of things in nature they can tend to kind of look after themselves a lot better over time. So the answer is yes, and the way that would work in terms of the cash flows is that you would have a range of parties saying, well, we're paying for a certain amount of benefits, and we're going to tailor our contributions in terms of payments, which maybe reflect, although it's not an equal matching, those benefits, and that those cash flows help to underpin the reserves for maintenance in the future. So it might be, for example, a water company looking at its benefits of water quality. You're looking at maybe a 20-year horizon, and you say, well, actually, it's going to get better over a number of years, but we'll start paying at this flat level, and that's going to help underpin getting the project set up. But as you go through over the years, there's that cash flow available to be able to underpin the maintenance. So yes, it does have to include both.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to come to another question to you, James, but also I'm going to ask Charlotte for her comment on this as well, for perhaps obvious reasons. So the next top voted question is really interesting lessons from the Netherlands. Do you feel that we can develop the culture in the UK to make similar approaches work here?
So I was I lived in the Netherlands for just over 3 years, and I've been working in a Dutch company for over 20 years. But I was a tourist, a cultural tourist in the Netherlands, which I loved. My own reflections are about culture generally is that you can be inspired by it, but it's not, the challenge shouldn't be framed as, well, can't we just all be more like the Dutch? It's just like, there is a certain way of transacting and relating, which is, and it's different in different parts of Britain. Let's face it. What I think we need to do is to figure out how can we get people turning up as individuals rather than downloading what their organizations and perhaps their organizational history has kind of built momentum to, which can create quite a lot of legacy barriers to and what I talked about in my talk about suspending disbelief. How do we get the individuals to show up and create the conditions for that co-creation to happen? And I think that there are some amazing people. A special call out to the team up in Scotland in SEPA and the Leven Partnership, who are kind of, for me, demonstrating a new form of partnership-based entrepreneurship, where it's not about them, it's about being able to bring people in a different way. And I think that's already kind of leading to a lot of positive benefits. So I think it's about how do we create our own version of it, rather than thinking that we can cookie cutter import it from the Netherlands.
That's great. Thank you very much. Charlotte, would you like to comment on that, please?
Yeah, sure. I think it also has to do with previous disaster events. So I think the reason that in the Netherlands, so I mentioned before in Australia, for example, funding for disaster management is historically been 97% versus 3% to mitigation. In the Netherlands, it's actually pretty much the opposite way. And that the main reason, but I believe, is that comes from the history of flooding in the Netherlands. So in the 1952 flood, 2,000 people in the Netherlands died. So the government had to do something. And that's when they started with the whole Delta plan, and all the Delta works were set up. So I think that is a very good example of a change in government due to what happens on the ground, and the push needed from a community perspective as well, following this event. And you can see that anywhere, also in Australia. You just need a big event for real change to happen. And that's very sad, but that's unfortunately how it just works in practice.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Charlotte. Okay, our next question, again, it was to you, James, but I'm going to want to bring you in on this as well, Charlotte, if that's okay. The question is about traditional investors look for tangible financial returns on their investments. And so what are the arguments and conversations needing to be had to attract those investors? So that question was to you, James, but I'm also going to seek some comment from you, Charlotte, and particularly around the savings and betterment funding that you spoke about in your presentation. So I'll come to you first, James, and then over to you, Charlotte. Thank you.
So I think that in anything in terms of innovating and catalyzing new financial models, and a lot of the work that Emma and the team at Green Finance Institute are doing, the main challenge is being able to kind of translate the ideas and the concepts into the tangible financial mechanisms and cash flows that investors need. That's not to say that all financial investors are one homogeneous lump. They're not. There are different types of investors who are investing in impact-first strategies. There's some who are more catalytic, some philanthropic funding, government funding as well, which could be used to leverage in the more mainstream private flows of capital. So what in the process of investment readiness is about being able to lock down all of those contracts and to build in a financial model where all of the different financial investors can see what it is they're getting. So from a risk perspective, you've got two lenses. One is, well, if we do this, if we put our money into this, what are the physical, whatever, if it's nature-based or some infrastructure, what are the physical risks in terms of being able to get the benefits we're going to expect to get from this project? And secondly, given all the counterparties who've got to contribute to make this work, what are the risks that they might not be able to pay? So there, if you've got a nice balance in terms of, well, you can see that they're getting this benefit. I mean, flood reinsurance, for example, is like, well, if they're not paying to make the flood risk lower, then they're going to be paying out more on insurance. So you can tell that actually there's greater security there. Being able to bundle together that risk analysis to support those cash flows is how the projects get funded.
Thank you very much, James. And Charlotte, please.
Yeah, there's a range of examples. I think I could mention with the Betterment, for example, one really good example is the Gainda water intake, which was severely damaged in 2011, I believe, and then rebuilt for $1.2 million. Then in 2013, it was completely damaged again, and then rebuilt. And then the Betterment Fund was reinstated, which actually decided to move the water intake up near a weir and also made it submergible. And the outcomes of that, I'll have to pick up my little notes here. For an incremental cost of only $850,000, the cost savings already exceeded $5 million because it did not flood and was not damaged in two subsequent events. So that's just one example of how Betterment works. Betterment is only, I think, the first step towards innovation in building disaster resilience, as opposed to recovery and reconstruction. There's also other programs to mention. For example, in Roma, a town in sort of Midwest Queensland, they built a levee there. And one of the good things about the results of that program was that the insurance premiums of the properties near those levees decreased quite significantly. So there's quite a few projects where we have examples where insurance, where we engage with the insurance industry to ensure premium reductions for the community as well.
Do you mind if I come in with a quick point on this as well?
Please do. Emma.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. So I think there's around trying to achieve commercially attractive returns as well. There is the other option of using blended finance, which is what we've been, has become increasingly of interest over recent years. And blended finance, in effect, is using a small amount of public capital to attract in more private capital to make the returns of a project attractive. So if we look at the offshore wind sector, there was cornerstone investment, which then de-risked the overall project and meant that project financiers were comfortable to invest. Another interesting mechanism, which we at the Institute very much support, is the use of credit enhancement guarantees, where the government guarantees a portion of lending done by private institutions, which can allow borrowers to either be able to access finance in the first instance or to be able to access lower cost finance. And again, a short-term program of guarantees to pump prime a market, get investors comfortable with an asset class, and also bring in economies of scale can be a really effective way of helping build up particular markets.
That's great. Thank you, Emma. In fact, I'd like to stay with you, if that's okay, because I think one of the questions here perhaps allows you to expand on some of that a little bit. So the question is, what organisations can access different green finance mechanisms? Are they limited or open to all public, private and voluntary sector?
So green finance really does span across all different areas of finance. So, individuals looking to retrofit their property, their home, to make it more flood resilient. We're seeing an increasing number of green mortgage propositions come into the market that offer attractive financing rates if you're looking to undertake some kind of home renovation. If you're a corporate looking to undertake flood resiliency or coast resiliency measures, again, there are corporate finance suites out there. If you are able to aggregate demand, you can tap into the debt capital markets. But we still know that for organisations which maybe have less ability to access finance, or slightly less sophisticated in being able to tap into those larger markets, there are a lot of schemes that are either being brought out or coming to market that you can tap into. And one that James mentioned, which really should have a shout out, is the Investment Readiness Fund, which is a fantastic opportunity to innovate, demonstrate new ideas in a safe environment and with safe funding setup. So I'd recommend, if the organisations on here are interested, having a first port of call is probably having a conversation with your bank, and they'll be able to point you in the direction of some useful funding mechanisms.
Great, thank you. That's great advice. Thank you very much, Emma. Okay, and thank you to all of our speakers and panel. We've run out of time, I'm afraid, in this particular question session, so we're going to move on. Just to note that all of the questions that have been posed will be captured as part of the post-event output, and it may be possible for us to get some answers back to some of you as well on those questions where you've identified yourself. So the other thing just to draw to your attention is that we opened at the start of the event a Slido poll. And so if you're in Slido, you'll see there's two tabs on the top of the application. One is for questions, the other one's called poll. We're really keen to get your insight and input to the three questions that are being asked in that poll, because they will directly help inform the finance session that we'll be running at Flood and Coast 2021. And I'll tell you a bit more about that towards the end of this event. So please do look at the poll and tell us what you think in response to those questions. Okay, back to the business today though, and I'm going to hand back over now to Emma, who's going to introduce our next speakers. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks, Terry. So we now move away from the strategic and international perspective to have a more localised look and localised approach to resiliency investment. And I'd like to introduce our next panellist, Sam Evans. Sam is Head of Natural Environment at Greater Manchester Combined Authority, leading the Combined Authority's work to improve and increase investment in the city region's natural environment through developing strategy and policy, delivering key projects and working with a range of parties. This includes oversight of the EU-funded Ignition project and Natural Course project, and delivery of the Greater Manchester Local Nature Recovery Strategy pilot. Prior to his role at GMCA, Sam led the development of the Mayor's 5-year environment plan and supported the development of Greater Manchester's Natural Capital Investment Plan, both launched in 2019. Sam joined GMCA in October 2018 from the Department for Environment, Flood and Rural Affairs, where most recently he was Head of Strategic Coordination. Sam is going to provide a local authority perspective to financing natural environmental solutions that address the climate emergency, including habitat and carbon banking. Sam, thank you very much for joining us today, and over to you.
Thanks, Emma. Morning, everyone. Fantastic to be here this morning, and already great to hear from this morning's speakers. So yeah, I'm Sam Evans, Head of Natural Environment at Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we've been doing locally on trying to build the case for investment into our natural environment. So Greater Manchester, like many other urban areas, faces significant impacts from the effects of climate change, particularly from the risk of surface water flooding, due to ever-increasing rainfall intensity events on sealed urban surfaces and capacity constraints on our drainage infrastructure. And we know that urban nature-based solutions, so sustainable drainage systems, green walls, green roofs, more green space, are key to solving these problems, and that they provide multiple other benefits for biodiversity, recreation, and health. But we also face with a problem that responsibilities and opportunities to manage surface water flood risks sit across multiple public and private sector organisations, and public funding to take action is under increasing pressures. So that landscape means that there are already inherent challenges and barriers to be overcome to secure investment in tackling that issue of surface water flood risk. So I'm going to talk a bit about the work that we're doing as partners across GEM, and it really is a partnership approach that we have in Greater Manchester, including local authorities, Environment Agency, NGOs and others, and particularly focus on one of our key projects, the Ignition project, which is looking to make that investment case for urban nature-based solutions. So could I have the next slide, please? So nature pays and it performs. I think this is a crucial starting point, really. Nature-based solutions are accepted as having significant potential to address the challenges I've talked about and provide those multiple benefits beyond just managing climate risks. Their benefits are well established and the principle of their worth accepted. And we've really tried to build on this evidence base in Greater Manchester and lead the way on this over the last few years. So particularly within Ignition, we have compiled a huge evidence base of over 1,000 pieces of national and international evidence to demonstrate the benefits of urban nature-based solutions, and published several reports with our partners to set these out, covering the benefits of SUDs, green walls, green roofs, and all the different types of benefits they bring that I've already talked about. We're also demonstrating the value of nature-based solutions through a £1 million living laboratory at the University of Salford, where a green roof, green wall and rain garden are shortly going to be completed, a connected system of nature-based solutions with in-depth long-term monitoring at the university to show the benefits that interconnected set of nature-based solutions will provide. And we are connecting that data on performance of nature-based solutions with the fact that it pays. And I think for us in Greater Manchester, this has started with embedding a natural capital approach. So seeing the value of our natural environment and the benefits that flow from that, and putting monetary values on those. So as part of the Urban Pioneer under the government's 25-year environment plan, we led the way on developing urban natural capital accounts, which show that in Greater Manchester, we get over £1 billion worth of value from our natural environment each and every year. And that is really important for shifting the dial on the conversation, not just that nature is good in terms of its environmental benefits, but also provides us with those financial benefits as well. So embedding that principle is really key for us to get that buy-in strategically. So the principles and the tools to account for the value of our natural environment in GM are becoming increasingly mainstreamed, and we've led some national work in doing that. Next slide, please. But as we've heard from this morning's presenters so far, we have to pay for nature-based solutions and get a payback on those if we're to attract other sources of investment. And acknowledging the benefits of nature-based solutions through our work on the evidence base and that living lab in the University of Salford does not magically lead to that translating into investment. And as we've heard, investment in natural capital is an emerging market, but most of the burden, certainly within GM and England and the UK, still falls, and the expectation still falls on the public sector to deliver, which we know obviously is increasingly limited in the funding that it could provide. As we've heard, bringing in private finance can help change that by bringing in greater amounts of capital, reducing costs, sharing risks, and leading to investment that the public sector might not prioritise or be able to deliver on its own. But to pay for it in that way, by bringing in private finance, we obviously, as we've heard, need to make MBS investable, moving beyond proving their environmental benefits. And in GM, we're trying to move that dial to confidence that those benefits have a monetary value to beneficiaries, which can be translated into financial returns. And we're faced with similar barriers that others are in trying to develop MBS projects. Lack of robust business case, which set out the benefits in financial terms against assessment of the costs and the risk. Bringing forward a pipeline of investable projects at sufficient scale, and particularly locally needing the capacity to be able to put work into developing those pipelines at sufficient scale and developing those business cases. And once those are developed, having the kind of the delivery, the financing, the contracting structures in place that provide investors with confidence to be able to invest in projects. So all that infrastructure that goes around delivery of projects. So those are some of the barriers that we've heard about this morning and that we are certainly facing within Greater Manchester. Next slide, please. So the challenge for us and the role we're really playing as the combined authority in bringing together all those different groups and organisations that I talked about is how we connect capital to investable projects, and how do we overcome some of those barriers that I talked about. And through the Ignition project, we are working through the several key steps that we see and that James has talked about. We're working through those barriers through this project. And I think, as others have said, this isn't going to be a big bang of multi-million-pound investments from where we are now in terms of the market for MBS maturing. And we're trying to build the confidence that financial benefits can be realised and form the basis to pay returns. So in terms of those steps, I've already talked about the first one, which is around proving the environmental benefits of nature-based solutions through the Living Lab at the University of Salford, through all the monitoring that will go on through that, and a real seeing is believing site where people can go and see the benefits of MBS in action, and also through the evidence base that we've pushed out there and are promoting. The next step beyond that is identifying the financial benefits associated with those environmental ones and identifying beneficiaries of those. And through Ignition, we are building business models for investment in nature-based solutions and working particularly with our water company, United Utilities, and the local authorities to understand the benefits and the beneficiaries of MBS projects. And I'll talk through in my final slide the model that we are developing to do that. By the end of the project, we're hoping to have assembled an initial project pipeline, which I'll go into a bit more detail on the next slide, that we then will hope to be able to raise investment to deliver and help us prove this model can work and can be scaled up elsewhere and become mainstream. And those are really key steps and key steps really to beyond the lifetime of the Ignition project, which comes to a close next year, which we hope will kind of provide the basis for investment in MBS to become more mainstream and contribute to some of the other projects we've been hearing about this morning, the projects that will come from the Investment Readiness Fund, to really start to build that case for investment in nature-based solutions. So next, final slide, please. So just coming on to my last slide on our first investment case within the Ignition project. So as I said, we're working to take forward a set of projects through to a stage where they can attract private investment. And our first model involves sustainable drainage systems. So those natural features like ponds, basins, channels being installed on sites with the primary aim of managing the surface water flood risk that I talked about. In terms of the urban environment, we're looking at public buildings, so local authority owned buildings where there's a greater chance of some of those wider social benefits that James talked about being realised, so those health and recreation benefits. But that also has the advantage of us dealing with a smaller number of landowners, so the 10 local authorities within Greater Manchester, rather than the multitude of different landowners that one gets in an urban area. In terms of where, we're looking at areas where SUDS could reduce that risk the most, particularly reducing risks for United Utilities, our water company, and the resulting financial risk to them of surface water flood incidents. And this model provides monetized benefits from those environmental benefits that SUDS brings. It brings financial benefits to the water company in terms of reducing flood events, and it also brings financial benefits to the owners of the sites where SUDS are installed. In Greater Manchester, we benefit from United Utilities' incentive to install SUDS, where they reduce charges on non-domestic bill payers, where they can disconnect areas of their sites due to SUDS. So we've got two revenue streams there. However, it's important to say that some benefits that we think will still go unpaid for, those health benefits, property uplift benefits, for example, that are difficult to monetize. So I think just because we've been able to identify benefits and benefits to organizations, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are set up to or have the confidence to invest in getting those benefits. So we hope that bringing in private investment on the back of that will help catalyze investment, share the risk of non-performance, and generate genuine returns for investors over the longer term. And we've seen similar models to this work in other cities, for example, in Washington, DC, in the United States. In terms of ongoing challenges that we face in making this a reality, I think the regulatory landscape in the UK, particularly around the water sector regulation, can inhibit investment. So we have short-term spending and policy cycles which can change annually, versus the longer payback of nature-based solution schemes. And ours are typically over a longer period of time, looking at sort of 10 or 15-year paybacks. Partnership working's been mentioned. That is really key. Collaboration between organisations, aligning budgets, decision-making, governance, data sharing, things like that we found have been really crucial in developing that shared understanding and getting everyone in the same room and on the same page. And related to that, that takes capacity. Developing this pipeline of projects takes capacity. So being able to put resources into local areas to be able to develop these proposals is absolutely key. So we are really trying to push this agenda forward in Greater Manchester. Just to finish, we've also established this year a Greater Manchester Environment Fund, which has already attracted £2 million of funding, and our ambition is to grow this alongside the growth in the market for natural capital investment, including on biodiversity net gain, carbon offsetting, as well as the nature-based solutions we're looking at through here. And that fund we've set up to help fundraise and attract investment into GM's environment, so both public and private, to manage that public and private investment together and to provide the right governance structures to give confidence to those wanting to invest in GM's natural environment. So I will conclude there, really looking forward to the questions that follow afterwards. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Sam. Really fantastic introduction, insights into the Ignition project being run by Greater Manchester Combined Authority. And very interesting what you said at the start around being able to quantify the benefits, not just environmental, but also social and financial, and how that can help generate buy-in. But actually you need that private investment and you need that resource and capacity to move these opportunities into reality. So fantastic insight there. Our next speaker is Kit England. Kit is the project manager for Climate Ready Clyde at Sniffer, a sustainability charity that brings people and ideas together to create a sustainable and resilient society. He has worked on climate change for over 8 years, specialising in adaptation. Most recently, he has led the work to develop Glasgow City Region's first climate adaptation strategy. He has also worked on research and capacity building for projects for the Scottish Government, DEFRA, and the Association of Directors of Environment Planning and Transport, ADEPT, and the Committee for Climate Change, in partnership with some of the UK's leading consultancies, including ACOM and Arup. Kit is going to talk to us today about the adaptation finance gap. So Kit, thank you very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks, Emma. That's brilliant. And I will try and whiz through a little bit quicker and get us back on time with lots of time for questions at the end. So hopefully you can, yes, I just need to pin myself up. There we go, you can see. So as Emma mentioned, I manage Climate Ready Clyde. Climate Ready Clyde is a partnership approach to adaptation planning for Glasgow City region. We have 15 different partners from the public and private sector who pool their funding to do their adaptation planning together. Just as a little bit of background, Glasgow City region is about a third of Scotland, both in terms of economic output, results in about 40 billion of GVA a year, but also people. We have about 1.8 million people in the area as well. So it's a big chunk of Scotland. And on the west coast, as you'd imagine, we have a lot of heavy rainfall, but also a range of different climate change risks. But I think it's important when we start to talk about adaptation finance, and I'm talking about it here in the context of putting together Glasgow City region's first climate adaptation plan. But it's useful to remind ourselves that it's a global issue, right? So this slide here just shows you the assessment by UNEP that was published last year of the adequacy of adaptation planning globally. And what you can see from this is about a third of countries around the world, have adequate adaptation plans in place in terms of a range of different criteria. So UNEP assessed these last year, and right in the middle in implementability, you can see there's a very, very low level of countries that have really good regulatory instruments, incentive-based instruments, and direct investment going into adaptation. And just to sort of say, I mean, globally, the Climate Policy Initiative sort of, has estimated those kind of flows. And a lot of that finance, is dominated in climate investment into mitigation rather than adaptation. So if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, please. The first thing that we did for Glasgow City region, we developed our resource mobilisation plan alongside our main adaptation strategy and developed the two in parallel. So we have a really ambitious transformational adaptation strategy, which is coming out in June, and I would thoroughly recommend you look at. But actually, if we want to be really radical and really transform places so that they flourish in their future climates, then actually you've got to think about the financing really early on in that as well. And we map the finance flows available in Scotland to fund on adaptation. So this diagram on the right shows you the sources, on the left, sorry, shows you the sources, the actors, and the instruments that are needed for funding adaptation and how they fit in Scotland as well. But as part of that, we also unearthed a range of different kind of barriers that are sort of acting on reducing the flows of funding available for adaptation. And it's just worth touching on those for a second. So globally, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change isn't very helpful for funding adaptation finance in developed country contexts. And that's because historically, a lot of the UNFCCC discussions have been about how do we fund the 100 billion under the Paris Agreement into developing countries, rather than recognizing that adaptation is a global issue that requires every single country, every single city, every region around the world to think about it as an issue. And so a lot of the global discussions have really focused on that developing country finance flows. That's starting to change. We had the Global Summit on Adaptation earlier this year. We've had the Global Commission on Adaptation, and people are starting to really get that it's an issue for the UK, for example, just as much as mitigation, but it's taken us a while to get there. Brexit is also a really big issue because what it does is it cuts off a lot of the grant-based financial support for cities and regions that was there under the European framework and that isn't there at the moment under the domestic regimes in the UK. So we had access to the LIFE Fund, the Urban Innovation Actions, which funded Ignition. We also have access, or we used to have access to the European Investment Bank, which had a dedicated set of facilities there for adaptation financing, and that's gone. So that's challenging for us to start to scale investment and adaptation. But lastly, there's also a set of, we discovered in reviewing the sort of the literature around it, there's a lot of particular barriers for business cases and adaptation more generally. Things like the discount rates, actually you only start to see the benefits for adaptation in a lot of projects coming through in 20 or 30 years. Some of the adaptation work is really just a public good and there's not a lot of commercial return in there. So those things still have to be bridged. But it was a useful piece of exercise to undertake for us to really start to understand what the landscape looked like. Next slide, please. Sorry, I feel a bit like Chris Whitty at the moment. But the second piece that we did as well is we tried to take a bit of a top-down view and understand what's the scale of finance that we think is needed on an annual basis that isn't flowing at the moment. And so this is the first piece of analysis we've seen sort of in the UK, at least at a regional level, where we're trying to estimate actually how much money do we think we need to flow into adaptation. So what we did is we took this is a first pass at looking at public expenditure needs for adaptation based on the amount of public service expenditure in 2018-19. So we took the national statistics for our 8 local authorities and what they spent. We stripped out the money they already spend on flood risk management. And we did the same with the NHS health boards. And then we allocated a percentage uplift based on some of the global values of how much adaptation or climate risk rather is likely to wipe off the value of institutions, and used that to calculate an investment need. And that gave us a target of about 184 million a year. So across the spread of risks that we have in Glasgow City region, and that it doesn't just cover flooding. We have to remember we also got heat, we've got coastal erosion, we've got sea level rise to deal with as a challenge. We think public services need to be spending an extra 184 million pounds a year on adaptation now to make sure that we're prepared and that we're flourishing in a future climate instead of just responding to those risks. And there's a lot of problems with that methodology, which I can get into in the Q&A, but it at least gives you a number so you can start to have a discussion with people about how you need to up your investment needs. Next slide, please. But at the same time, our adaptation strategy is really ambitious, and we're not just looking at incremental change for adaptation, we're also looking at transformation. And so what we started to do is develop a finance typology that helps us think about what types of finance are appropriate for what types of intervention and project and program. And the matrix on the left just shows you that. So you might use, we talked about 2 types of finance, conventional finance and transformative finance. And we also talked about the types of adaptation that we're looking to do. In some cases, it's about incremental change and scaling up what we're doing already. And in some cases, it's transformational. It's a complete change in social and economic structures in a way that helps us manage climate risk. So against those kind of 2, you can start to have this matrix. And in the sort of top left, you can see, conventional finance financing incremental adaptation might be public sector funds using grants, quite business as usual. And in the bottom right, transformative finance for transformational adaptation really is about new instruments, new financing models, but for more innovative approaches and for more systemic approaches as well. And the graph on the right just shows you, we started to map against that matrix. We started to map and get into the detail of, well, what are the different types of funding sources that really sit in that space. So it's slightly confusing because it's upside down, but on the right hand side, we really wanted to be in the top right. So looking at where we're able to mobilize transformative finance for transformative adaptation. Next slide, please. So what does that look like in practice? This will be coming out in our resource mobilization plan when it's published in a couple of months, but it's just useful to kind of give a couple of examples. So, for that conventional finance for incremental adaptation, you might take, the UK government's funding of flood defence infrastructure, for example, or Scottish government. But where you might also be funding incremental adaptation, but you want to use transformative finance, Emma was talking a little bit about blended finance, and actually you might use public and private investment to fund green infrastructure, or you might use crowdfunding has been happening with abundance investment for new investment, for example. But then when you get into transformational adaptation, in the bottom left, you might see that you might use conventional finance to change the fundamental governance structures of the way that regions are developed to help your adaptation planning. So we've been talking about a shared adaptation planning unit where we start to merge SEPA and local authority staff to get a better kind of flow of new development into the city region, where a lot of the flood risk management issues and climate issues are managed through the development process. And that might be conventional finance, but it actually leads to transformational outcomes where you get new developments coming through with a much higher standard of resilience in the built environment, in infrastructure, etc. And then finally, in that box on the bottom right, around transformative finance for transformational adaptation, we're piloting and developing new models where we might do place-based regeneration using blended finance, or we might use green bonds and public-private partnerships for long-term investment in an adaptation pathway. So next slide, please. But what we've done is we've drawn those together into a set of strategies for bridging the adaptation finance gap and a delivery structure for doing that. And apologies for the slightly horrendous diagram on the right, but this is the emerging strategic finance approach for how we deliver on our adaptation strategy. But what we say really is that we need 3 strategies. So, and a lot of the speakers today have touched on this in different ways. So we sort of know that regardless of how much funding we're able to leverage out of the private sector, we're going to need to increase the amount of public grant going into adaptation for certain things. So having those figures about the adaptation finance gap and refining and improving those really help, and starting to link them to particular types of adaptation investment helps us really understand that we're going to have to spend more money on adaptation as the climate risks increase. At the same time, we need to be encouraging a more commercial mindset in the public sector, so using public-private partnerships or financial leverage, and also really starting to understand, for example, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure and what that means for the city region. So we've been looking, for example, at which companies are already located in Glasgow city region are subject to TCFD legislation or will be, and where they're most likely to lose value as a result of transition risk or physical risks. And then lastly, around financial innovation. So we need to be making sure that we're funding approaches to new business models and new approaches in the city region. And what we're proposing there is an adaptation finance lab, which will incubate and support the development of new business models in the region for the next 4 or 5 years. So those 3 strategies together form the basis of our delivery, but we also need more systemic and more transformational approaches. And this diagram on the right sets out how we look to bring that together through a portfolio of innovation. So what we're looking to do is bring public grants, public and private equity and debt finance and de-risking instruments like insurance and guarantees, and blend them together and push them into the different approaches and mechanisms that we need in Glasgow city region. So our adaptation strategy has 11 interventions, and we'll be looking to coordinate some of those through Climate Ready Clyde, but through some of them through particular delivery partners. And then at the same time, we have this portfolio of systemic change and systemic innovation that we're going to bring forward that will come together as well. And those will lead us to conventional and transformative finance solutions and to interventions on the ground. And at the bottom there, a couple of people talked about the enabling environment. That's really important as well, having a really strong understanding of what are the policies and regulations that can unlock the kind of those delivery as well. So that's been quite high level, but I'm also conscious of the time. So I'm going to pause there, and I'm happy to get into any of the detail of that in the Q&A, but hopefully that's been a useful overview.
Thank you, Kit. Incredibly useful and fantastic to see that the work that you've been doing on the adaptation strategy, in particular, your point around actually matching the finance to the appropriate types of projects based on their risk and return profiles. It's a very critical element of green finance. So the matrix and the delivery approach that you've designed is very interesting for us and the audience to see. So now, having heard from all of our panelists today, we're going to open up to the virtual floor again and take questions from the audience. Again, I hope you've all been energetically engaging with Slido and been throwing your questions into the mix. So Terry is going to start relaying some of the top questions to us. So Terry, do we have any further interesting questions?
We do indeed, Emma. Thank you very much. Yes, let's get straight to it. The top voted question at the moment is actually to you, Sam, but Kit, I'm going to come to you as well because you've referenced this topic in your presentation just now. And the question is about private finance is obviously going to be important for a lot of projects, but some adaptation is still just a public good. So the question is, to what extent does Greater Manchester, or indeed in general, I think for you, Kit, still accept that there will be a need to increase public sector funds for adaptation? Over to you first, Sam. I completely agree, and I think Kit articulated it very well that there will still be an ongoing role for public sector funding into adaptation, and we're finding that with the work on our business model within Ignition that there's probably likely still to be a gap between those benefits that we can identify a beneficiary for. We can monetize those benefits. There'll likely be a gap between those and the overall cost of the scheme. So I think our model has the role for private investors repaid first,
and then potentially roles for be that foundations and their interest in seeing this market develop, and public funding. And we've been working to look where we can align other public funding, so potentially Section 106 funding, any LLFA funding, to bridge that gap. And we're also looking at wider within Ignition where we can align things like infrastructure spending, so local authority and our Transport for Greater Manchester, they've got significant infrastructure programs where we can align those with investment in SUDs and adding value to those programs to bring in nature-based solutions. So it's going to be part of that stack of those investors and of that mix on an ongoing basis.
Very much, Kit. Interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I think I would very much echo that. I think where we're starting to get to, and what's really helpful with these kinds of discussions, is we're starting to be able to understand where those public goods are versus those public and private goods. And that's a really good place to be, because then you can start to really quite sensibly approach a lot of those projects. I think one of the things that really needs to happen quite seriously, though, in all public investment is around mainstreaming, and we're starting to see that to happen in Scotland. But where you're making the UK climate change risk assessment really looks at things like the risk of lock-in, where we're making very long-term decisions now as a country, where if we're not planning for climate change risk, we're potentially locking in either reduced revenues for commercial projects, or we're locking in further public spending down the line. And actually that starting to build in that kind of consideration of climate change risk. It's done in all the development banks internationally now. It's done with the European Investment Bank, starting to get that mainstreamed into public expenditure across all, whether it's infrastructure spend, whether it's new development, etc., has to be a crucial lever. And it's also part of that really important approach to leverage as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, let's move to a different question now. And this comes from my friend Mark Shepherd at Jacobs. It's a question directed to you, Sam. Private water companies seem to struggle to commit to paying for flood risk reduction benefits due to uncertainties over their long-term funding priorities as set by Ofwat. So do government and regulators need to help create a more predictable and stable financial environment for utility companies? Gosh.
Short answer, yes, and that's been borne out by certainly by our work. So originally, we and based on previous work that had been done before Ignition, United Utilities provide that charging band reduction, an almost ready-made incentive. We thought to be able to base a model on. However, due to that issue, the regulation of the water company, they cannot guarantee that really beyond a year. So there's not that that long-term certainty. When the government brings forward mandatory biodiversity net gain, there'll be a legislative certainty around that. It will be in the Environment Bill, and the requirement to maintain those sites for 30 years as a sort of contrast to what we're facing. We met with Ofwat just last Friday actually to talk about some of this. They are interested in and have a priority around incentivizing nature-based solutions. So we are feeding into work that they are doing with the Environment Agency to tackle just that issue. But yeah, I completely agree that we are coming up against those barriers within the work of Ignition, and have been speaking to Ofwat about how they can help water companies overcome them.
And I wonder, thank you. And I wonder if we can expand this out to maybe yourself, Emma, or you, Kit, as well. Just around this has long sort of puzzled me really about how we create alignment between investment and return on that investment, when often businesses are working to completely different timeframes and financial horizons, etc. Is that not a sort of a major blocker still for us in making these arrangements work?
So I think we're starting to see some interesting developments that will align organisations in different sectors and with different timeframes. So last November, the Chancellor of the Exchequer announced that the TCFD, Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosure, methodologies were going to become mandatory for organisations in the UK from, I believe, 2024. So there's going to be increased information and transparency out there. And what we've seen previously is, as you increase transparency in this space, you start to drive action because you're exposing actually where those risks lie. Now, there's an interesting development with the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures, which our Chief Executive at the Green Finance Institute is co-chairing, which is looking to replicate the climate-related disclosures, but for nature. And again, that could be a very interesting catalyst for action within the water sectors and those other sectors that have a strong connection. So there is an interesting interplay between policy and market-led initiatives and how they can kind of meet together in the middle and hopefully provide the information that's needed to make decisions that do deliver rapid action.
Great, thank you very much. And Kit, yes, please.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think there's a range of systemic levers we need to pull on the finance system to get us into the space where we're really meeting the challenge at the right scale and pace that it needs to be met at. I think the other thing to say is that I think as cities and regions are starting to see climate impacts, they're starting to see, that there's a need to put capacity into longer term planning, and that's starting to come through. In Glasgow City Region, we have an investment prospectus now, which puts forward a range of different projects as an ongoing investment for kind of potential investors into the city region. We're about to become a TCFD supporting city, where we are actively supporting those disclosures, and we're producing reports which show how we're aligning and kind of meeting the needs of the private sector in that as well, which is really helpful. I do think there's also, there is a set of reforms needed, not just in terms of fiscal policy, but monetary policy and the role of central banks internationally. That has to happen soon, because otherwise, the kind of fixing the structural inequalities in the monetary system, that has to come first for a lot of governments to start to put more investment into adaptation more generally, I think, as well. So I would say there's kind of needed to be reform both at cities and regional level, but also actually internationally, that will help drive this forward.
Excellent, thank you. Really good to hear lots of references to adaptation, I have to say. But we have a question here which is perhaps more related now to mitigation, and it's to all speakers. And I'm quite happy to bring in Charlotte and James on this as well, if you have something you'd like to contribute. And the question is around how individuals and organisations now actively are seeking ways to offset their carbon use to meet their net carbon targets. So is there a way that individuals and organisations can invest in urban and rural nature-based solutions as carbon offsetting? I'll go to you first, Sam, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, I think through the work we've done on Ignition, I think we are finding that particularly for urban nature-based solutions, that the links to climate are more challenging to make, just because the nature of those urban nature-based solutions, they're not their carbon benefits are more limited than what you may be able to do in larger tracts of land, thinking of woodland creation and tree planting in more rural areas. Within Greater Manchester, we have a large area of degraded lowland peatland out to the west in Salford, and we have we have upland peatland on the fringes as well. So we do see this as an opportunity, and one of our proposal to the government's investment readiness fund was around stacking the benefits of carbon and biodiversity on our lowland peatlands. So restoring some of those degraded lowland peatlands, creating habitats, but also locking up carbon and trying to stack up those benefits there. So I think we see more potential for carbon around where you've got large areas of land for woodland creation and peatland restoration in particular, and perhaps slightly more limited in terms of the urban NBS. But we see it as a really big opportunity, and that's where a lot of the interest, from our corporates and companies within Greater Manchester is particularly around their carbon budgets and aligning those with our 2038 carbon neutrality target in Greater Manchester. So we are trying to channel and align that with what we think it could be best used to deliver in terms of peatland restoration in particular.
Great, thank you very much. I'll come to you now, Kit, and then maybe Charlotte and James as well if we have time. So first of all to you, Kit, what's your thoughts around that question?
I mean, around carbon offsetting and into nature-based, I think it's going to be a really interesting issue to see come forward. I mean, there are, when you look at the Science Based Targets Initiative, they put offsetting right at the bottom. So, what we should offsetting and kind of should be one of the last strategies that companies are using to kind of reduce their emission, because there are lots of justice issues around using land in other places around the world to make sure that other companies can carry on doing business as usual. So it is a bit of a controversial target. What I think is really helpful, though, is around the potential for UK projects to start to position themselves as investable propositions for carbon offsetting and adaptation. And in Glasgow City Region, we have a project called the Clyde Climate Forest, which is going to be launching again in the summer. But what that's aiming to do is part of a £1.1 billion investment into green infrastructure and green networks across Glasgow City Region, and really aiming at three things. One is about carbon and making sure that we have a kind of a local ability to offset some carbon. One is around canopy cover and making sure that we're investing into areas for urban heat and protecting against urban heat and surface water flood risk. And the last is around connectivity for habitats and species. And actually what we're aiming to do is to position that as a investable proposition for a lot of the public sector and the private sector in Glasgow City Region, who want to both be able to offset their emissions, but also have projects where people can see the results in their own places, right? If you look at the universities, the two universities we have in Glasgow, we have University of Strathclyde, University of Glasgow, their scope 3 emissions are horrendous because of the sort of the academic travel and all that kind of stuff. And so the only way that they're ever going to get to net zero, we've set a target in Glasgow of being net zero by 2030, is if we have those offsets available. It's just not going to happen otherwise. So it has a really important role to play. And the other thing is that you can, if you're clever and with the targeting, you can get both your adaptation and your mitigation benefits together, because you can start to target some of that planting into, we're looking at particularly urban neighborhoods where we've got very vulnerable communities who are disproportionately affected by flooding and by heat waves. So if you structure those properly, you can get some really good social outcomes and some really good environmental outcomes. But I would sort of caveat that with the fact that really it should be seen as the last resort by companies and organizations, and they should really be looking to get to net zero through improvements in efficiency, changes to business models, etc. first.
Yeah, here. Thank you very much, Kit. Charlotte, can you give us perhaps some thoughts from an Australian perspective?
I can, but a bit of a disclaimer that this is not my field of expertise, carbon offsetting. But I just had a quick peek online just to find about what Queensland's doing in this space. The main issue with carbon in Queensland is removing native forest for grazeland. So that's one of the major issues here. The Queensland government does have two funding programs. One is the Land Restoration Fund, which aims to expand the carbon farming by supporting land sector projects that generate ACCUs, which stands for Australian Carbon Credit Units, through land management activities. And then there's also the Australian Government Emissions Reduction Fund, which is a primary source of funding for projects that create these ACCUs. I'm afraid that's probably as far as I can go, but if there's further questions, I'm happy to get you in contact with people that more across this space.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, James.
Yeah, I'd love to come in. I mean, I think that I've got quite strong personal views on offsets. I mean, firstly, the language which you use about offsets. I mean, offset is deferential to a stream of pollution, which we need to be decarbonising in the first place. And it therefore kind of cuts off those range of benefits that Kate and Sam both talked about in terms of biodiversity of nature, in terms of resilience, in terms of social well-being. And I think being able to think in multiple dimensions rather than reducing it to one is critically important, because as the oil and gas majors start to do forests, they might be quite rubbish forests from those other perspectives. And I think that is, that's something which we need to kind of, think more systemically about. I think there's also something about where things take place. I think that there's really salient points Sam made around urban nature. I think nativation in the EU has done some good work, but you need to bring in those other benefits. It won't be able to stack up on carbon benefits alone. Where things take place, if you take in terms of agriculture, the soils have got 3.5 times more carrying capacity for carbon than the plants. And marine is double what's going to be on land. Being able to stimulate the right kind of blended investment into those markets is going to be really critical. And there's, as regulation and markets are created for this, I'm part of something called Climate Safe Lending Network. We've just put out a paper called Financial Stability in a Planetary Emergency. We've got to have the right rigor around these markets, because you can't, for example, take positive sequestration credits for reforesting something, but still be deforesting elsewhere, or even worse, funding deforestation and then kind of trying to get the benefits of the credits for reforesting it a few years later. So I think that those kind of more general bits of financial regulation and science and the environmental regulation have got to come together. Just like in the pandemic, it's got to be led by the science and then enforced by the relevant agencies of financial regulation.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm afraid that's the last question that we have. I'm just going to hand back to Emma now, so you have the opportunity just to wrap up a bit for us, Emma, and then be back to me to close the event. Okay.
Thanks very much, Terry. And it's been an absolutely fascinating session. We have covered a real breadth of innovation that's happening both on the domestic stage and internationally. And what we heard from our first speaker, James Vicaro, the importance of making investors and investees comfortable in nature-based solutions and bridging that knowledge gap was critical. Charlotte highlighted the importance of tapping into local communities who understand nature-based solutions at their best, and then being able to work collaboratively with government to deliver useful financing mechanisms. And then when we started to look away from the strategic and into more of the local on-the-ground case studies from the UK, Sam gave a brilliant example of the Ignition project that's happening in Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and the benefits of quantifying the environmentally positive and socially positive outcomes of nature-based solutions. Well, Kit gave us an overview of how being able to match the types of financing to the types of projects can really lead to capital actually moving. And it'd be remiss not to mention the fact that in the UK, there is the exciting opportunity of the Investment Readiness Fund that is coming down the line, and encourage everyone to have a look into that. But I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us today, and thank the audience for being so diligent and bearing with us through a few technical issues. So thank you very much. And I'll hand back to Terry, who's going to close this excellent session today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to you, Emma. Yes, if I can just sort of add my thanks, please, to James, Charlotte, Sam and Kit for their presentations. And thank you, Emma, for chairing our event so expertly. I have to say, whenever I feel anxious about the enormity of the challenges that we are facing, I remind myself of the quality of the people that are in the Flood and Coast community. And that's been very much displayed today by our speakers and evidenced by the participation from our audience. So thank you very much for taking part today and for attending. My thanks also to Federated Hermes International for their sponsorship that's enabled us to run this event. If you're not familiar with Federated Hermes, then I recommend you visit their website and get in touch with them, because you'll see actually much of the ideas shared today being put into practice. I'd also like just to remind you to submit your thoughts on the Slido poll, please. It will remain open for the next week. And this is a really useful resource for us to help inform the finance session at Flood and Coast 2021. And so to that event, we are really looking forward eagerly to Flood and Coast 2021. We have a simply fantastic programme in place. We have 4 themes over 4 days, looking at delivering together, future skills, knowledge and tools, a nation resilient to climate change, creating green and sustainable places, and adaptive planning and thought leadership. And I can assure you much of the discussion we've had this morning will carry through into some of those sessions. So please do visit our website for bookings, and also please do get in touch if you'd like to sponsor the event and align your organisation with what's going to be one of the most important digital conferences of the year. Now, I realise that's a big statement to make, and so I'll tell you why it is so important that you are part of Flood and Coast 2021. Coastal and inland flooding is the #1 risk from natural hazards in the UK and in many parts of the world. And as a community, we have the capability to manage this risk, provided we work together as a community. However, I think our responsibilities go much further than to our sector. The COP26 presidency has set out a number of challenges that we must make progress against, many of which relate to adaptation and building resilience. To be blunt, we know this stuff. We've been developing adaptive approaches and building resilience for a number of years and decades in the flood risk world. And so we have a duty to share what we know with the COP leaders. I think there's much that our sector can teach to others, as well as elicit support for our own sector in doing that. So Flood and Coast 2021 will build upon the outcomes captured from the 2020 series. And over the 4 days, we'll develop those into coherent, strong messages from the flood and coastal community to take into the COP. Now, who would not want to be a part of that? Take care, everyone, and I look forward to meeting you in June. Thank you very much.